p.m. Thank you all for coming. My name is Pedro dos Santos. I'm the Associate Professor of Political Science here at CSPSJU, and I take students to Brazil every 2 years. And so this is the time we're going. There's some of the students here from before and from now. And whenever I do this, I like to bring people into campus to have a conversation about Brazil. And so this worked really well. Dr. Biroli was here. She's originally in Brazil normally, but she was here this semester, so it was really great. So, so her talk today is part of the Global Awareness lecture series, Far Right Politics and the Dispute Over Gender Equality in Brazil. For those of you who I talked to about this, I'm super excited. And Dr. Biroli actually mentioned, I forgot about this, that I actually interviewed her in 2010 for my dissertation research when she was already, kind of an up-and-coming researcher. And she is one of the biggest names in democratic politics in Latin America. So I'm very excited that she's able to come here. She's a full professor of political science at the University of Brasilia. And currently she is the McCarty Family Eminent Scholar at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. She was the president of the Brazilian Political Science Association and one of the founders of the Brazilian Network of Women Scientists. She has worked extensively with the UN, with the Brazilian government, on issues about democracy, about gender inclusion, and all different aspects. She has published too many things to name here, books in Portuguese and Spanish and English, in all possible languages, always in this context of democracy, and really connecting political theory with empirical analysis, and with an emphasis on gender politics, which is kind of how I got involved with her work. A lot of her work really influences how I do stuff. So again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Brad, for being here. So I'll leave it to her to start our talk.
Hi, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you so much for inviting me to come. He was very generous as he did his presentation, but I'm also a fan of his work, so it's really good to have this opportunity to talk to you and to engage in discussion with Professor Pedro as well. So what I'm bringing to you tonight is first some arguments and results from the broader research that I've been doing on conflicts on gender in Brazil and in Latin America, so that you have some information on the political process, the main actors, and how I understand these conflicts, which concepts have been used in my research to discuss these conflicts. And then I will present part of a research that has mapped actors and disputes on issues related to gender and the family during the recent Bolsonaro government in Brazil, because it was very representative of a kind of political change that had to do with the access of anti-feminist actors to the Brazilian state and to the process of policy building. So it's a case study, and it can also, I understand, help us think about other cases and the kind of dynamic that is related to these conflicts, which issues are being disputed, how they're being disputed, which strategies have been mobilized transnationally and in specific national cases. So I will start by giving you a perspective. Do you hear me well? Yeah, is it okay? Okay. Giving you a perspective on the political process that presented opportunities for different actors to dispute the state, to advocate for their agendas. So many Latin American and South American countries specifically, they had dictatorships during between the 1960s and the 1980s. generally military dictatorships with civil politicians participating in that. So in the 1980s, we had processes of transition to democracy, of democratization, which were very important not only from the perspective of democratizing the state itself, but because they brought new opportunities to discuss problems, for example, to debate inequalities and the kind of policy that is necessary to address inequalities. So democratization had a lot to do with new actors taking place in public debates, in institutional public spaces, to discuss which problems the country needed to address and under which perspectives. For example, was the state responsible for health, the health of people? Does this have anything to do with citizenship? So the 1980s, the transition to democracy in Brazil was an important moment for feminist movements and women's movement to participate not only in the promotion of their specific interests and agendas, but also to take part in the debate about the Brazilian state, what in Brazilian democracy corresponds to in terms of rights, citizenship, public services. And because this was the process of defining a new constitution as well, so they took part in this constituent process. And this happened under a favorable international context in terms of women's rights. We are talking about the first conventions on the discrimination on women, for example, 1979, the CEDAW Convention. And then in the 1990s, we are talking about the cycle of human rights conferences of the United Nations, which I see as a process in which the human rights system has become really to include gender, sexual rights, women's rights as human rights. So this is explicitly said, that you probably have heard the enunciation that women's rights are human rights. And this, maybe for us now, it's we kind of take for granted, but this had to be said. It had to be included in conventions, in international documents, and this was going on as transitions to democracy were developing in Brazil and other countries in Latin America. Then afterwards, in the beginning of the 2000s, Brazil was one of the cases of the so-called pink tide, or turn to the left. And this was, the pink tide was a period, and that's the map there, the red on the map has to do with this center to left-wing governments which were elected after 1998. And at this point, the first decade of the new century, Latin America had 16 countries governed by center to left parties. In Latin America, this meant that we had now a majority of governments that had historically been committed to debating and as political parties to challenging inequalities and debating alternatives to deep inequalities that are historically part of how Latin America has been structured and how relationships of power and status have been built. So this was again an opportunity for social movements that were committed to equality and to equal rights for women. And at this point, a language of gender relations was already part of how they were claiming rights, right? So there is if you were interested, Pedro can afterwards also in his classes give you some more references on that, but we have extensive scholarship comparing pink tide countries because, as I said, we had 16 countries at one moment governed by center-left parties. And they were not all the same in terms of gender rights, women's participation, and even like the opportunity of progressive social movements to participate in policy building in different issues happened in very different ways depending on the country. So these studies, they point out, I mentioned one here, that defines the Brazilian case as a transformative case. Because it was not in all of these countries that there were significant transformations. And I'm not even saying like in people's lives necessarily, but even in policy. Like not all of these countries had significant transformation in policy concerning women's rights, women's political participation. So Brazil is a transformative case in this literature on the pink tide. And there are some characteristics here that I think that are, I should share with you, but they are like the arguments after empirical comparative analysis to which the authors have arrived. So first, when you say center to left parties, they can be distinct kinds of parties, right? So in Brazil, the party was the Workers' Party, which is back to power now with the presidency of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Maybe you've heard of Lula. And so the Workers' Party existed since 1981, and is a very institutionalized party. So it was not, although Lula is very famous, it's not a party that gravitates around one person. It's very institutionalized, has internal institutional mechanisms for defining candidacies, and and has a strong social basis in social movements. So when the Workers' Party got to the federal government, was elected, women's movements, feminist movements, they had new channels to influence policy, to take part in policy building. And that's when one of their demands was met, and we started having a national agency of policy for women. And in some countries, so Gustavo, Madeira, and Caminotti, they compare different countries. So in some countries, these agencies were adopted, but they were like symbolic. And in Brazil, what they say is that they had capacity to plan, they had budget, and they have a strong bureaucracy that could develop and implement policy. So of course this was important for this case to be a transformative one. You have, like, one of the things that the literature on gender has shown is that state capacity is fundamental to implement policy that can produce gender equality, guarantee rights. So Brazil had, relatively to other Latin American countries, Brazil had that. Plus, Brazil was already a case of the development of participatory arenas that were at the same time civil society participation arenas, but formalized as part of state consultation and even the definition of budget in some cases, like where the budget goes, and so distributive decisions. So this, they were part of our democratic constitution, which is from 1988, but they had not really been implemented before 2003. So this was also important as a channel. So there were achievements, and these achievements had to do with something that is always important in gender politics, which is the politicization of issues that maybe before were seen as private issues, family issues. So for example, gender-based violence. Why do we need policy if this is like a family issue? Why do we need policy if this is an individual issue? So they were really working on not only like making policy, but kind of convincing, through public debate, the people and generating like a new legitimacy for some issues as political issues, not as private issues or individual issues. And this also, of course, produced increased visibility and legitimacy. And as I said, this was a favorable international context what makes a big difference. So these are some images so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is Lula when he was in his first year as president in 2003, when he launched the secretary with the status of Ministry of Policy for Women. This here below, people who study Brazil, they know well about those this kind of data. We have an institute of social and economic science, which is part of the Brazilian state. And for the first time, they started producing data on gender and race. So that meant that to make policy now, you could really have more empirical evidence from where to depart. And at the same time, we had the participatory arenas. So there were conferences of policy for women, gathering different social movements at local, state, and national level. And protests also revealed that these networks of women and feminist women as well, they were very plural. So this is a protest of rural women, and their agendas were sometimes overlapped with, but they were different from the agendas of black young women protesting against racism and gender-based violence. So this is just so that you have an idea of how, when I say that they had more visibility and legitimacy, we are talking about different dynamics that have to do with being able to be part of state building, policy building, but also take part in public debate in different ways. So it's common for people researching democratization in Latin America that they just look to the changes that produced a more plural political environment by discussing the so-called progressive social movements. But one thing that we know about the Brazilian case is that pluralization also meant that we had a renewed participation of conservative actors as well. So as feminists, LGBT, anti-racist movements were gaining more space and visibility, these actors were also there. And they also wanted to have a say on what the state, the democratic state would be, what this democratic society would be. And Brazil was at the same time going through a very important, very significant change in the politics of religion and the landscape of faith. So Brazil was known as the largest Catholic country in the world, the country with the greatest number of Catholic believers, together with Mexico. And what we have seen since the transition to democracy, it's of course a coincidence because there are other factors playing into that. A coincidence in terms of time, right? It's not that the transition to democracy produced any of what I'm going to say, but it's a demographic change in terms of religion and belief. So we now have less people who identify as Catholics, and evangelical churches have really increased their presence in societies. And it's interesting also to have in mind that there is a secularization process. It's not what we can see in Europe or in some countries in Latin America like Uruguay and Argentina, where more than 1/3 of people would say they're not affiliated to religious organizations, or they are agnostic or atheist. But we had an increase from 8% to 13.9%. And there are other aspects of like practical life that would point to a process of secularization. So we have less Catholics, more evangelical, and more people saying they are not connected to any institutionalized religion. But at the same time, when we say, oh, we have more people now saying they are evangelicals, Pentecostal in particular, we have data showing that these are people who are more embedded in religious networks. And so one of the important data we have is, for example, that evangelicals, those who define themselves as evangelical and go to evangelical churches, they go to religious services much more often than Catholic believers in Brazil. And that means that, if you see here, 80% of evangelicals, but only 36% of those identifying as Catholics, they say they attend religious services at least once a week. So this is important in terms of politics, because that means that people are sharing their views, they are meeting other people that are part of the same congregation, the same church, much more often than those who are Catholics are, right? And another data we have is it's not related only to what people say they are, like how they identify in terms of religious identity, but how churches have developed, like the number of churches, and I think this is very interesting. Oops. If you look at this, I will just very briefly explain. So, well, here there are the numbers that maybe are more like, they are very clear, they express very clearly what I want to say. So Catholic Church, between 1998 and 2021 in the country, they have gone from less than 9,000 to 294 churches. Traditional evangelical, like for example Baptist Church and Anglican Church, they have gone from 8,539 to 23,000. Like it's such an increase in the number of these churches. But Pentecostal and New Pentecostal evangelical churches, as I said before, they have quadrupled. So they were 36,000 in 2021. What does that mean? That means if you go, you guys who went to Brazil, maybe you saw that you have new kinds of churches. They can be small churches, they can be big churches that have become part of the urban landscape, the rural landscape, in ways that were not there before. So when we say, oh, Brazil was one of the biggest Catholic countries in the world with one of the biggest Catholic population, that meant that when I was a kid, I would go around, for example, travel car trips with my parents, and we would see Catholic churches as we passed by cities. And now we see many more evangelical churches. So there's a difference in how religious is part of the communities and how people connect to other people through religion, and also how churches support people in places where the state is not strong enough, is not present enough, with basic things. Lawyers, sometimes health services, psychological services. So it's really something that has to do with how communities work and how religion is part of them. So this could be just part of social changes and cultural changes under democracy if we did not have a very important connection between a new far right in the country and evangelical leaders, as well as conservative Catholic leaders. And the language of anti-feminism, opposition to gender rights, has become a common language for these groups. So this is actually what my research is trying to understand now. How these alliances have been working, which effects they have on democracy. Have they been able to roll back rights? Have they not? Is this more like a symbolic kind of, spreading narratives against feminism and gender, or are they changing laws? So this is what I've been researching together with other people. So this is what studies on the Brazilian case have been like the main arguments that have come from different research. So one thing is, as the religious landscape changed, we have renewed mediations between political elites and voters. And I think it's interesting because it's not, I put it there because one of the studies, especially Smith and Boas, they say that pastors have become intermediaries, where before priests were intermediaries, especially in small cities, small towns. But I think it's very important to think of how local communities work and how religion, the religious and the secular, like they are not that separate in people's friendships, you know, people's practical arrangements. And so this is something that I think that is important also to think when you think about mediation. Not only like people intermediating political dynamics, but shared views, who people talk to when they are, for example, trying to make sense of an electoral race or a new policy on something. Brazil, and this is really regional, had very important progressive grassroots Catholic activism in the 1970s in particular, but 60s, 70s, and so I don't know if you have heard about the theology of liberation, which was very important in Latin America. And we had changes that had to do also with how the Catholic Church, like the Vatican, saw these movements within the church, these most progressive movements. And under the papacy of John Paul II, there was an official policy by the church against the theology of liberation, because it was like too close to Marxist perspectives, materialist perspectives on society. But it's kind of interesting because as the Catholic Church receded, it lost ground not only in terms of believers, numbers of believers, but also in terms of like grassroots networks and movements. So these progressive Catholic movements, which are not there as much anymore, they still exist, but they are very they have really decreased in size and in presence in society. They have open space somehow, like as they were not there anymore, for this kind of grassroots conservative religious politics that is now very important. I will show you some images in Brazil. We also saw, since 2018, it's recent, new cleavages coming up around gender and sexuality, and they connect to religion. So people who do electoral studies on the behavior of votes, they have been pointing out that we didn't have, gender was not an issue, religion was not an issue in terms of like the patterns of vote, the behavior of voters, and now it is. And more important for my work, we have this connection, let's say, between far-right movements and leaders. So far-right movements and leaders and conservative religious leaders. So far-right movements and leaders embracing the disputes on gender. And as they do that, they get religious conservative leader support. And these offer resources for popular mobilization, the intermediation I was talking about, the capacity to mobilize people that maybe were not that worried about politics, but then someone says, oh, you know, they are teaching your kid at school that they can, I will say the way they do it, that they should become gays or trans people when they are very little. They are teaching your kids something that, you know, can make them target for pedophilia or something. And so maybe these people, they end up, you know, seeing politics as the place where they are disputing the safety of their kid. And maybe the safety of their kid is really an issue, but not really because of that, because in Latin America we have like organized crime, poverty, and precarity as something that really affects those kids. So there's this kind of politicization going on. But we do have very real, because the way I was saying here, we could think, well, gender is a strategical narrative, right? And it is. it is, I understand that I propose in my work a concept of moralization of insecurities. So people are insecure, but for other reasons. And the moralization of insecurities is something that is coming as a way to like frame the problems and mobilize around gender. But there are very real perspectives shared by far-right actors in Brazil and conservative religious actors on what social order should be and what the family should be, and this ends up being like common ground for them. Here are some images that maybe can illustrate what I'm saying when I say that we have a renewed politics of religion. So for those who are not so familiar with Latin America and Brazil specifically, the Catholic Church was always influential. But we wouldn't see this kind of scene. We think this is the Brazilian Congress, the Chamber of Deputies. This is Bolsonaro when he was still in office as president. So this kind of religious, like public spaces and public rituals becoming religious spaces and religious rituals. And this, I think this is something that we could maybe think about and is part of possible potential agendas for research. If a society, if you were talking about religious societies, does that mean that public arenas can also be religious spaces, or that religion can be like a language, a kind of structural perspective organizing politics? So this kind of issue has been raised a lot. And this is one of the biggest religious manifestations in Brazil now. It happens every year. It's called March to Jesus. So it started as an evangelical mobilization, and it's still mostly evangelical, but it has also conservative Catholics participating in it. And what I show here here you see the Brazilian flag, and this was not something that was there in the first marches. So this proximity between the far right and religious organizations also brought up new symbolization for religious manifestations. And this, I think, is interesting because one of the characteristics in Brazil is that we have, since the democratization, we have political parties which have been created by evangelical churches. Brazil is a very fragmented political party system. So we now have 26, if I'm not mistaken, political parties represented in Congress. But we had, I think 8 years ago, we had 36 political parties represented. And so this is one party that is very openly related to the one church, which is the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which is like this international corporation really with business in Africa, all across Latin America. And they have renewed the way they relate to the world and to women. So this is an image for local elections now this year. They want women as candidates. And at the same time, they have just published their new manifesto, in which they say that, our manifesto highlights the need for order, respect, and discipline as a way to guarantee the survival and advancement of humanity, as has been the case in the past. But well, we know that in the past, very recent past, women could not be leaderships, right, leaders, and that a certain past order had to do with a gender order and gender hierarchies. So it's interesting how they organize these new and also traditional values as part of their political perspective. So the literature on conflicts around gender has been talking about a backlash here in the US and in Latin America and other parts of the world, Europe as well. And I do use the term backlash, and for people studying this kind of phenomena, it's important to define, conceptualize the backlash, so that's what I do here. So I depart from the concept by two US authors, US political scientists, James Mainsbridge and Sean James. And they say that there is a backlash when some actors have a perception that they have lost the capacity to influence the state, public policy, laws, so they have lost power as capacity, they say. And I have like reproposed this concept in a way that we can think of the backlash as when some actors, they react to their perceived loss, not only of influence over the state, policy and law, but also their influence on conducts. So in other parts of my research, I show, for example, how family arrangements have changed, birth rates have gone down, people's perceptions of relationships and sexuality have changed so much. So it's not only like the religious landscape that has changed, policy has changed so much, and we have achieved a lot in terms of policy and law to protect women and guarantee gender rights. It's also in racial as well. I'm not talking here about that because it's not part of the research I'm presenting to this point, but I will talk a little bit about this now. But it's interesting to, in my understanding, to think that like you have levels. So you have changes in policy, you have the democratization of the state, you have changes in conduct, people are less religious, people are, so there are, women have changed a lot the way they relate to, for example, education and jobs. And so the reaction, I think, is not only related to losses in terms of influence on policy and law, but also to changes in society, very important changes in society. Brazil is a case of backlash, has been approached like this by different studies. And I'd like to make very explicit that when we talk about a backlash against gender, we are also talking about campaigns and narratives against gender rights, which are not national, they are not local. We are talking about a transnational force, transnational network of actors. So have you heard about gender ideology, the term gender ideology? Yeah. So when the term gender ideology was brought up, it was brought up by Catholic intellectuals from Catholic circles in the 1990s against the inclusion of gender perspectives in the UN, the documents by the UN conferences of 1994 on the population, the Cairo conference, in 1995, the fourth conference on women that happened in Beijing, and that has produced very important landmark platforms on the need of states that are member of the UN to really commit to, for example, ending violence against women in their countries, recognize reproductive rights, sexual rights. So how could feminists promote this kind of agenda in the UN conferences? Because they were also part of transnational networks, and that's when we start having the reaction, the backlash coming from transnational networks. At first, the main actors were the Vatican and the League of the Arab countries within the UN. And then we had the mobilization, a very strong mobilization by religious-based organizations against the right to abortion. If you think of Roe v. Wade in the US, was a decision from 1973, right? So when we get to the 1990s, many organizations had really had become organized around abortion to prevent the decriminalization of abortion in other parts of the world, in other countries. So there's plenty of study on how these networks function. But what I wanted to mention is that the fact that this is a transnational phenomenon, that we're talking about transnational networks, does not mean that nationally, locally, it always develops the same way. The conflicts and the way the actors they position themselves in local politics. So we have, like, they leverage campaigns, international campaigns, but they take part in very specific political processes, right? So this is just some illustration on things that are very important in this Brazilian case. First, when we had the impeachment of the first woman president we had, Dilma Rousseff, and the impeachment campaigns, I've written about that and many people have, were very misogynistic, and many of the actors voting for her impeachment, they would vote for the family against the left-wing party, the Workers' Party. So this is when they were holding signs saying, "Bye, querida," like dear, but this has a very important gender connotation in Brazil. It's like saying, "Oh, bye, little girl," to a president. So it's something that had a... Then, in 2 years, less than 2 years, conflicts had escalated so much that this is what happened when Judith Butler went to Brazil to give a conference. So there were groups protesting against her conference, trying to block her conference, the access to her conference. And they had an effigy of her burning and pictures of ex-Brazilian presidents that they identify as liberals, and also a picture of George Soros from Open Society. So this connection between, like, funds coming from international labor organization and local politics. And that sign there is an example for people who study Brazil. They identify it very easily. But it's from a Facebook page of a conservative religious organization saying that if you are a Christian, you would never vote for the Workers' Party. PT is the Workers' Party's Partidos Trabalhadores. So, like, this crystallization of positions around an opposition between PT and anti-PT, which is important in the Brazilian case. So this is maybe a little specific, but it's interesting because in some countries, for example, in South America, Peru is a case in which left-wing and right-wing parties, they all now share the language of, we have to combat gender ideology, we have to avoid discussions on gender at school. In Brazil, it's not like that. There is a very clear opposition between progressive perspectives on gender and race on the left, and the Workers' Party represented that as it open space for social movements to promote policy. It was conflicted, but they were opening space, and there were many achievements on that. And on the right, we have, like, the reactions against this kind of change in politics. And in Brazil is also specific because it was, as a case of backlash, because the country elected a far-right government in 2018 that was openly anti-feminist. So when Bolsonaro took office, his inaugural speech had less than 8 minutes. It was something that was, like, journalists were like, say, oh, this because previous presidents, they would talk like half an hour, 25 minutes, 20 minutes, and he talked less than 8 minutes. And in this very short period, this very short time, he said that his government would be a government that would promote the values of the Christian majority. So it's a kind of a registration of a perspective of majority in Brazilian society against gender ideology and political correctness. I'm quoting him. So this kind of perspective ended up being official policy. Pedro, how long have I spoken? Do you have? How?
We spoke about 40 minutes.
40 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to, it's a specific part of the research on the Bolsonaro government that we've I developed with Dr. Luciana Tatajiba. And so, because I just need to to say that once again. So during the democratic cycle, we had an openness to social movements, for social movements to participate in policy building. So when Bolsonaro is elected, a little before, with the impeachment, we already had like a closure of the state for progressive social movements, for the participation of progressive social movements. But in 2018, the Bolsonaro government promoted the participation, openly promoted the participation of anti-feminist actors. So we mapped who these actors were, their trajectories, their networks, and how they operated on specific issues. And so just that you have an idea, and this is very, like in terms of political science, it's very important to understand what kind of alliance or what kind of coalition support governments. So we have proposed this understanding that it was a heterogeneous coalition, but it was convergent in terms of gender and human rights. And that means that before, like during the democratic cycle, before the far-right government, we had social movements, but we also had religious actors, and they were all part of the coalition. It was very conflicted, but it was also very plural in terms of the perspectives on gender and human rights. And here, it's not that all the actors which were part of the government were like active anti-feminist politicians or anti-feminist activists, but none of the groups that were that made the coalition of the Bolsonaro government were pro women's rights, pro human rights, or they wouldn't voice an opposition to the actors which were, for example, anti-abortion, anti-same-sex marriage, some perspectives on women's rights. So there was this exclusion and hostility towards the social movements that participated in the PT government, including the feminist movement. And here, when we mapped the actor, we mapped all the actors in three ministries: the health ministry, the woman, family, and human rights ministry, and the education ministry. So in our work, we describe the connection of the networks of these different actors. Here, I just bring some of them just as an illustration, and I wouldn't have time to really describe them, but I want to tell you something about them. So we had the Secretary of Policy for Women that I made that was created in 2003 by Lula, one of my first images there, of Lula young there announcing the creation. So this secretary with status of ministry became the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights. So they reframed the perspective of the ministry, and the minister was now an evangelical lawyer who had a long trajectory as an anti-abortion activist, and also like working in Congress, supporting the we have fronts, we say, coalitions within Congress, the evangelical front. And it's common that people studying Brazil say, oh, things have become so much more conflicted because evangelicals are so conservative. And in my work, I have been showing that the alliances with conservative Catholics are like key to the conservative politics. And so under her leadership as the minister, Damaris Alves, the lawyer, the evangelical lawyer, anti-abortion activist, there was a secretary of the family, Angela Gandra, who is also a lawyer, but a Catholic lawyer. She's part of an important family of jurists. Like her brother has been a minister of a court. Her father is very well known. And they are part of the Opus Dei, the very radical conservative Catholic organization. So Angela Gandra, the Catholic, together with the evangelical, but she was responsible for the international networks. So she was here in the US, she was in Poland, she was in Hungary, she was very close to a Polish organization, which is ultra-conservative Catholic organization called Ordo Iuris. So there is all this networking and like how not only narratives but resources are going around. So at the same time, at the Ministry of Education, we had different ministers under Bolsonaro, but this one was important because as he was leading the ministry, many of the politics related to promotion of equality were suspended. And so he is also a pastor. I forgot to say that Marisa is a pastor. She's not only evangelical, she's a Baptist pastor. He is a Presbyterian pastor, and as the Ministry of Education, he was part of the promotion of militarized schools, but also this suspension of discussion on inequalities, not only gender but racial inequalities. And this year, Rafael Câmara is a Catholic doctor who was in charge of the primary health secretary of the Ministry of Education, and he really took as his role not only to limit the access to legal abortion. Brazil, if you want to say that, has 3 exceptions to the criminalization of abortion, 2 of them since 1940. And he was, together with Damaris, office involved in very important, spectacular action to stop the abortion in 10 and 11-year-old girls who had been raped. Cases of exception to the criminalization that existed in Brazil since 1940. So, but he was also very involved in changing the protocol related to natural birth, something that was quite interesting for me. I have a master's student working on a research on that because I thought, what has natural birth to do with abortion? But it was, he defined the fight, like women's fight for natural birth, for the right to have natural birth, because in Brazil, like 80% of women end up having cesareans, is that what?
C-section, yeah.
C-sections, yes. And so there is this movement, like to have access to like more control on their the birth. And he said that the fight for natural birth was part of the promotion of gender ideology. So they end up kind of, overlapping different things, but they all had to do with women's bodies and the control over women's bodies. So I think that's quite interesting. I wouldn't have time to really go into the details about how we discuss the issues, but I want to tell you something that for those who are interested in the research on gender policy, we know we have a lot of studies showing that it's not like gender as a broad issue that is under dispute or that is developed or not developed as policy or law. There are always differences between issues, and they can also vary according to countries or even states within countries, depending on how the country's political federalism works. So we have long known that the so-called doctrinal issues, like abortion, for example, they are like highly conflictive, and the disputes around them are more conflictive. And that some issues, they were like less conflictive, and it was possible to build cross-party, cross-ideologies, coalitions more easily. And this was the case with violence, but we had quite a chance, and this is going on also in Eastern and Central Europe. So violence against women also became a highly conflictive issue. So our research shows, however, that some issues, as these anti-feminist actors become ministers, secretaries, they become in charge of gender politics, some issues, they work to delegitimize them. So by open public hostility, stigmatizing actors, and attempting to roll back law and policy. And this is the case of abortion. So in the case of abortion, we had open hostility, and this was expected, right? They were all anti-abortion activists, as I mentioned, lawyers involved in anti-abortion activism. But then we found this operation, this mechanism of translation in the case of violence. This means that these public officials, they will say, well, fighting violence against women is important, but we won't keep the policy we have. So, for example, we are not willing to discuss violence against women at schools to prepare boys and girls in a different way, because we understand that violence is the violent behavior. The violent behavior, for example, by men who use alcohol or drugs. So we have to actually strengthen the family. So the programs, the policy, and campaigns, they were completely changed. And so that's what we call a translation that operates through the language of rights, but displaces the focus on individual rights to family rights. And then as we worked on our data, we found that these two mechanisms, they were not able to really account for everything we were seeing, because there was a mechanism of silencing. And this is interesting because silencing, as they silenced, for example, they created an observatory of the family, which had as one of its roles to produce new data, because they were contesting the data produced on violence before. And as they did that, they suspended any discussion on racial aspects of violence. So there was no data anymore in the website, the official website of the ministry, on the racial dimensions of violence. And this is kind of interesting because our national data, produced by an institute that's part of the state and produced by BGE, the Statistical Institute, the main statistical national institute that produces the census and has the racial cleavage in every data that is produced. So they were like really dismissing it as a way to silence, we understand, about some kinds of politicization that were part of the period of democratization in Brazil, like making explicit that inequalities were racial inequalities, making explicit that social injustices were connected to racism, to gender, and so we had to actually change the way we were working, because we were, like, our initial argument discussed these two mechanisms to include the silence. Pedro, I won't really explain each of the, I will just, so we have like this, I had some explanation on how it happened in Brazil. I will just let you know that the main disputes on abortion now, they are disputes on the access to legal abortion, to abortion that is legal according to the Brazilian law. The two cases since 1940, pregnancy resulting from rape and risk of death for women, and a third case from 2012, from a constitutional court decision from 2012 that defines fetal anencephaly as a case that is an exception to the criminalization. So what they have been trying to do is to limit the access to, this is the main conflict, and even in the case of girls who were raped, who suffered rape. And in the case of violence, the translation mechanism that I was talking about was interesting because the material on fighting violence against women was all a material, like the images and the messages on families, on how to strengthen the family, how to have families that are strong enough to be resilient, and we had and then we had different effects. So relational perspectives have been translated into individual faults. So there's no patriarchy, there's no intersectionality, there is individual faults. There are men who are not behaving well, right? So, and we have to teach men how to behave, and this means you have to teach men to protect women. It's not a matter of right, it's a matter of protection, right? So this is, also it was interesting because they suspended existing policy and started like this new crazy policy that wanted to involve beauty agents, hairdressers, manicurists, because they should be able to see signs of violence and discuss them with women. And Brazil has like a long process of building law and policy on violence. So it was like, it was like trying to build up something from ground zero when you already had so much policy. And finally, as I mentioned, this approach to violence from a feministic perspective. So this is something that I would leave as one of the last words. Like, what does it mean to replace the idea that the family has to be protected? To replace the idea that individuals have rights with the idea that families have to be protected. What does it mean? For example, we have data, and it's not only in Brazil, showing that intra-family violence is something that is important. So how do we deal with that if we are protecting families and not guaranteeing individual rights? Finally, what does this have to do with democracy? So my work tries to develop the argument that we are not just talking about distinct perspectives. It's not like this, just the ebb and flows of politics, the alternation of forces, but we are talking about pluralistic perspectives on democracy, and on the other hand, unitary perspectives on morality that translate into limitation of rights. Limitation of basic rights, right? So this is going on in Brazil. We now have a different moment in our politics, but it's still there. But if you think of Hungary, if you think of Poland, and I would say also some of the processes here in the US could alert us to what it means to restrict rights in the name of promoting a certain moral order or protecting the family and all that comes under this language of promoting a certain gender order. Thank you, and if you want, I can answer any questions that you have. This is just so that you have an idea of how resistance displayed while all that was happening. And this is the bibliography in case you want to take note of something. Thank you.
Have some questions done?
Are you thinking that this backlash is going to be like somewhat temporary, or do you think they're going to like roll everything back and we're going to have to start again?
No, I don't think they're going to roll everything back. They haven't been able to do that, but they are doing a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think the conflicts will be a central part of politics in many parts of the world for a while. So when we think of how democracies were built, I'm not talking only about democratization very recently, but how like the definitions for citizenship, what kind of right the state should guarantee, what does it mean to have individual rights? What does it mean to have guarantees under a democracy? This is being discussed and rediscussed under perspectives that have directly to do with women's rights. Not only women's, racial rights as well, but if you think of how reproductive rights have become like a matrix for what kind of citizenship we are talking about, what kind of rights people can have, how much can religion be enough of an argument to restrict or expand some kind of right. So democracies are under debate in terms of their scope, their meaning, and the meanings of citizenship. And I think we are going to I would say that we won't see the end of that in our lifetime, including you. I'm much older than you, but including you. But there's resistance, there's a lot that has been done in recent decades, so it's hard to just roll back everything, right? But we do have very important things going on. So for example, in Hungary, there's censorship on anything that has to do with gender and sexuality in schools, but also in the media. For example, advertisements cannot have same-sex couples. It's prohibited in Hungary. So this is going on in many places. Thanks.
One of the images that you showed had the far right recruiting like women. And I'm curious across you might see the far right in like France or Italy with prominent women leaders. Mm-hmm. Is that something that's been successful in Brazil? And are there prominent women leaders who have the potential to be the next, president or prime minister?
Yeah. So Damaris Alves, the minister, the one that I showed that was the minister of Women, Family and Human Rights. She's now a senator. And she has been elected with a lot of vote, a very significant voting. And she's been considered as a possible potential presidential candidate for the party of Bolsonaro in 2026. I don't know if she will or will not be a candidate, of course, but it's one possibility. But it's interesting that she is not like the one. We have many women now that have been elected deputies, and under these, like the change of patterns and the new conflicts in Brazilian politics, and many of them are openly anti-feminist. It's quite interesting. There are some who have a very interesting language on women's rights. They say that we can empower women when we do not treat them differently. So for example, they are against electoral quotas, which we have had in Brazil since 1997. So they are against discussions on gender violence because they say, we don't need that. We are empowered enough. So this kind of thing. And yes, I think we are going to see more women, as we have been seeing in Europe, in Brazil and other Latin American countries, becoming candidates under very conservative platforms and parties.
We had like 3 of the largest voting of all time were women, anti-feminist women, in the last 2 elections.
Yeah.
They had the most votes for federal deputy and state assemblies in different states, and they were like anti-feminist women.
And at the same time, as all this was happening, we had the creation of the first front, as we say, it's a kind of caucus of feminist and anti-racist women in Congress. And we have all these young women being elected. In terms of number, the percentage of women elected in Brazil is very low. It's like here in the US, right? So on the left or on the right, it's a low rate. But we have this, it's quite interesting to see, because it was like, there was this one case, very well-known case of a woman who had been a deputy and a senator who defined herself as a feminist, and now we have like many in state assemblies and local. So we have both things going on, but right-wing women very successful in terms of voting, yeah.
Well, and also trans women. There's trans women elected in all levels of government throughout the country too.
Yeah.
In places that you wouldn't expect from a state comparison, conservative places where women are being elected for local and state elections.
It's very new. It's very new. So you have this, like the conflicts, they appear very openly because you have opposite trends happening at the same time.
One last question. Colin? Do you have any questions? Colin, professor here too.
Okay.
For class, we read your article on political violence against women in Brazil, and we've
yeah,
also been
absolutely,
talking about cleavages within the feminist movement, like the difference between Afro-Brazilian feminists and white feminists and the exclusion that's occurred. Does political violence against different segments of the feminist movement look different, or do they all experience similar levels of violence?
Okay, that's a great question. So one of the things about the concept of political violence against women or gender political violence is that it can lead us to think that women suffer violence as women, right? As if there were not differences in how these women take part in politics and how they are targeted. If they are black women, if they are, for example, trans women. So when I wrote that text, this is from the one from 2017.
17,
Yeah. So I was not like, this was if we were starting this discussion, but what I have developed later and what I think now, my arguments now would be that women are affected as women in politics because they are still seen as like entering an arena that was not created for them. But black women, also in Brazil, activist women, for example, women who are activists for land rights, they suffer different kinds of violence. So the kind of violence, the pattern of violence can be distinct. And I just wrote, I will send it to you, with someone I supervised, a lawyer who did her master with us, an article in which we proposed that territorial violence is an important type of violence to consider intersectionally how women are targeted in politics. And because we interviewed many women, and black women in particular, they talk about how violence impedes them from connecting with the community that they came from. Like they became politicians coming from certain communities, and they suffer violence in a way that they are so threatened. They suffer all these kinds of threats that they can, for example, go back to their communities. It's very interesting. And I don't know if you've heard of the case of Marielle Franco, a councilwoman who was brutally assassinated in Rio in 2018. And now, 6 years after the case has gotten to a solution. And Marielle was a black, poor woman coming from a very poor area in Rio. And now we know that she was assassinated because she was defending popular housing in areas controlled by the militia in Rio. But the militians who planned her assassination, they were politicians. So it's there's this is something in Latin America that is very complicated. Like there's this blurred frontier between organized crime in the state that is becoming much worse in Brazil. It was something that we would know about Mexico, we would know about Venezuela, Colombia, but it's become much worse in Brazil. Sad reality.
Well, thank you again for joining us. And we can keep having an informal conversation, but I figure respect y'all's time as well, so we can
Yeah, of course.
stop here. But thank you again for coming.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.